Welcome to Casual Politics, Lord Owen. Thank you very much. This is not your first time that you've been our guest, and I'm very grateful to you for that. Thank you very much. You need no introduction. You entered into Parliament back in 1966 to 1992. You've been a Defence Minister, a Health Minister, Foreign Secretary, and then you went on to form the so-called SDP. And now you spend your time debating in the Lords, but also writing books. And then
not much time in the Lords, I might say. Ghastly pace.
Yeah. And
it just must be reformed. It just cannot go on like that.
Absolutely right. And your new book, it's called Cabinet's Finest Hour. And so why then did you choose this particular period of history?
I think I really wanted to try and illustrate to a younger generation that there have been moments in our history when the cabinet has been the absolutely crucial element in our decision making, and never more so than in May 1940, when Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, put to the Prime Minister, newly enhanced Prime Minister of only 2 weeks standing, Winston Churchill, that he thought we should negotiate with Mussolini. And the wartime cabinet had just been formed, and only been really in existence since the 11th of May. And here was the Prime Minister on the 25th of May having a fundamental challenge, really, to his foreign policy. But he never resented this. He didn't even resist it. He knew this had to be discussed. The War Cabinet was 5 members, himself, and he was supported, of course, very immediately by Attlee. It wasn't his formal deputy, but the representative, obviously, as leader of the Labour Party, of the new coalition, and Arthur Greenwood. So straight away it was obvious that the mathematics, if you like, was in favour of the Prime Minister, 3-2, because Chamberlain was supporting at that stage Halifax, who had been his Foreign Secretary and who had been his choice to be Prime Minister rather than Churchill. And what is then follows, really, in 9 meetings, very confidential. Churchill denied their existence, said in his memoirs that it had never been on the agenda of the cabinet. True, in strict terms, it was so sensitive that there was no agenda, and these were confidential minutes and kept very close, and practically nobody else came in. Halfway through he brought in a reinforcement, you could have said. Sinclair, who was the leader of the Liberal Party, made it a war cabinet of 6, and he had been actually Churchill's number 2 when he had gone back after the problem of Gallipoli, and he'd been effectively removed as First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War. So this man was an old friend and was not an appeaser. But the fundamental thing was, the argument. Churchill immediately saw it and explained to the War Cabinet his view that it was not opening negotiations with Mussolini, it was opening negotiations with Hitler. And he also said, you know, the greatest danger was, once we started, they would call for a ceasefire, and once the ceasefire was established, and here Germany was already on French territory, already encircling Calais, and already ravaged right through Belgium. So it would be a ceasefire on German terms. And Churchill was very doubtful whether he would ever be able to restart. So it was a fateful line, he felt. Halifax developed his arguments in an open and considered way, but the skill was the way Churchill pulled Chamberlain slowly away from Halifax, very delicately, the balance of the argument. These were serious debates, well documented, and the book actually allows you to read the elements of the letters, the actual minutes which the people had. The chiefs of staff, for instance, on the 27th had a paper 4 pages, hurriedly typed, which they say at the end of the day they reserve their right to open up any of these questions because some issues have not been able to be discussed. A rather interesting assertion of a military position. Actually very fascinating paper saying they didn't think that Hitler would invade. If he did, they thought they could resist. The real test was going to come with the air battles in the future, and that depended on how much damage the bombing made of our industrial cities in the north, in our capacity to increase the build rate of Hurricanes and Spitfires to deal with the Messerschmitt threat, which was very, very serious. So they were completely correct, and it must have been encouraging for particularly the newcomers to the War Cabinet, Attlee and Greenwood, that the military were saying, you know, the challenge was not now, therefore not doing this was much more feasible. But anyhow, what I think comes out of it all, and as I say, people can read these documents, they can follow the arguments, they can make it up their own minds in reading the book. One of the most crucial moments in our history. It shows the strength of democratic debate, of collective decision-making, of the cabinet system, and this idea, this is old-fashioned. We've now gone through 3 disastrous foreign policy excursions. First of all, Suez, nowhere near sufficient, adequate, proper cabinet discussion under Stanton Eden. Then we've had Iraq under Blair, absolutely disastrous and shown up so by Chilcot. And they document the times when the cabinet should have been involved, full cabinet, and they were never a war cabinet. Ad hoc meetings, sofa government, all the disastrous things that we now see. And then Afghanistan, in the wake of it, was a further extension of some very bad policies. And then we had Libya under Cameron. So it seems to me that one of the ingredients is to restore cabinet government, and that's really why I wrote the book.
We will return to that later on. And when you go through your book, you get an impression that Churchill, when he first got appointed as Prime Minister, he didn't have the overwhelming support of his backbenchers. So he had to rely on some of the Chamberlainites, like Robert Boothby or even Bevin, who was more a Chamberlain man rather than Churchill man. So why did he have the support of his within his own party?
Well, Churchill had been a very controversial figure, had been out of power ever since he was dumped as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that was also one of his, biggest mistakes, really, the going on to the gold standard. And he had
changed parties as well.
Yes, but he was Chancellor of the Exchequer as a Conservative. Yeah. He didn't get on with Baldwin. Chamberlain didn't like him. He'd frozen out. He was basically once described as a beached whale. But he was the voice of anti-appeasement. Could have possibly been Eden when he resigned, but Churchill arranged that was not the case, and in a way I don't think Eden saw his role in that way. But Churchill was the voice of the anti-appeasers. He was seen consistently to be correct militarily in a lot of his informed interjections in Parliament. And it was very clear that the proper coalition had to be formed with Labour in May of 1940, and Labour was not prepared to work under Chamberlain. I think Labour would have been possibly ready to work under Halifax if he was the enthusiastic choice of the Conservative Party. But the revolt in Parliament, which brought this about, made it very clear that the people who wanted the change were people who were also in favour of Churchill. But he didn't have a majority, and that was why Nevile Chamberlain was so crucial to him. He couldn't really manage the animosity of the Conservative Party without Chamberlain being in the War Cabinet and being loyal to him. And Churchill played this very cleverly. I mean, right from day one, he said to Chamberlain, "Don't be in a hurry to leave number 10." He wasn't didn't want to be seen to kick him out. And then he said, "Anyhow, go back to number 11 when you're Chancellor of the Exchequer." And then he never really decided who was going to be his deputy. But once he had to go from the cabinet to France to go and talk to the French president, and he gets up from the table, and as he gets to the door, he turns around and he says, "Mind the shop, Neville." And therefore, you know, it's an informal way of giving him the role, and he flattered him, but he managed to build quite a close relationship. So by the time Chamberlain left the War Cabinet because of illness in the autumn of 1940, the two men were really working pretty well together, and it was very interesting how, I mean, Bevin, you mentioned, I mean, it was actually Churchill who told Attlee that he wanted Bevin, who wasn't even in Parliament, the Transport Workers' General Union. And
since the 1920s.
Yes, he was a powerful figure, but not a parliamentary figure, not a political figure, a powerful figure in the Labour Party. He didn't come into the War Cabinet until later. He was not there in May, but he was already beginning to be a very big presence. And it was a sign that Churchill wanted a proper coalition. It had to embrace the Labour movement, not just a parliamentary party, and he was absolutely right. But I mean, he turned out to be one of our great foreign secretaries, and actually really a pretty good parliamentarian. He came in without a by-election into Parliament straight away. But it was a sign of how, and he was all the time working. Churchill was playing, you know, first he had to get Chamberlain on his side, then he had to spread the coalition out from to embrace the whole of the Labour movement. And then he was very worried about this Tory opposition, so he was wooing Lloyd George. Very surprisingly, Lloyd George was an old person, and rather tempting to think was of no importance, but Churchill thought he would be the person who the critics would rally around, the man who won the First World War. And even though he was very elderly, he kept on trying to get him into the Shadow Cabinet, into the even the War Cabinet. He was ready to have him in, but Lloyd George, I think, was never going to come in as second fiddle, and thought there was a chance that he could come back as Prime Minister. So he held out. And then the fourth person,
He had become the father of the house, Lord George, at the time, didn't he?
Well, he made it, but that's no powerful. Yeah. That's just age, length of time. He was no. I mean, he even offered Lloyd George to go to Washington when our ambassador died, and eventually he pushed Halifax, fighting and screaming, out to Washington, which is a sign he didn't want Halifax around. He still thought he was really an appeaser, although probably incorrectly, actually. Halifax had ceased to be an appeaser very soon after Munich. But nevertheless, the other person, and the most central person he was after, was Roosevelt. And you start seeing these letters, the encouragement. But I mean, demands. I mean, he wanted 50 destroyers, and Roosevelt at that stage hadn't even decided to stand as president, and the isolationism in America. But all the time you see this capacity of Churchill, and to look beyond the present, and to be planning, and very strategic thinker. The other key interesting relationship is his relationship with Attlee. Attlee had been at Gallipoli and very nearly killed there, and suffered terrible dysentery, gone back in. But it was a revelation for me to discover that he never criticised Churchill's role as opening up the Western Front in the First World War. He thought it was an act of strategic genius. And he always considered Churchill, for all his problems with him and difficulties and management of him, to be a great strategic thinker. And I think that was why the relationship...
You always admired him.
I've always had a great deal of time for Attlee. I think he was a great figure, actually. And for a man of the left, I think he had very clear views on defence. He was a quiet, unassuming patriot. And in my view, the Labour Party must never forget that legacy. That's an essential strand of Labour Party thinking, and I think that Attlee had it absolutely clear. And indeed, we're talking in Limehouse, where he was mayor of Limehouse, just across the road. He used to live in an old LCC flat as a social worker. He had rooted feelings and rooted views on, and in many ways were very left. If you think of the Attlee 45 Labour Party programme, people talk about Corbyn if he's far left. I can assure you that programme was far further to the left. Yeah. So these things need to be kept in perspective, but the fundamental thing about this book is the value of cabinet discussion, debate, dialogue, and that this is the way to harness the best talents. Easier, of course, to go across party lines when you're in a coalition, but any sensible Prime Minister, and this is a lesson for the present Prime Minister, who to some extent, Theresa May, has definitely brought back cabinet government. But she must extend her reach, if you like, and her readiness to embrace other ideas. She's got to keep the UK together, therefore she's got to respect Scotland, Wales and Irish feeling, and the opposition. Brexit is a challenge to this country, and there are many lessons to be learnt of how Churchill and Attlee worked together, and how cross-party can bring strength at a time when you're taking big decisions, risky decisions about your country's future.
And when you go through another cabinet minister's memoirs, Rab Butler, who went on to become Chancellor under Churchill, and he argues that the potential successor to Chamberlain, when he stood down, he resigned, it was actually Halifax and not Churchill. But Halifax himself, he knew that from the House of Lords, he couldn't be the forerunner, the front runner to Churchill, and he couldn't, and his premiership would be threatened had he done so. So, and he knew that regardless of his position as Prime Minister, Churchill would be anyway the front runner during the war. So that's why he decided to not contest Churchill. So to what extent do you agree with Rab Butler's recollections?
Well, Rab Butler was an appeaser, an absolutely solid appeaser, and was supportive of Chamberlain right the way through, and was against Churchill becoming Prime Minister. Churchill actually made him Secretary of State for Education when he came back in. He was made Chancellor but later. Rab Butler was a sort of liberal, I think a good man and an intelligent man, but rather indecisive, and I think that's the reason he never became Prime Minister. He was one of these people who could have easily become Prime Minister, but he never really captured the heart of the Tory party. He was a minority figure, if you like, respected but not. And I don't think that he understood. He was not involved in the war. He wasn't in the war cabinet. He was in a fairly junior role under Halifax, kept there because of keeping Halifax quiet. He did at various times take an interesting view before the war cabinet was formed, before Churchill came in. He was quite sympathetic to opening a relationship with Russia before the war started, and that was also a Churchill policy. But there was not a very significant figure in this historical period.
And you mentioned Ernest Bevin. He was amongst the first Labour men who declared his opposition to the United States of Europe, and then Nye Bevan, Hugh Gaitskell, they all adapted his views over the United States of Europe as well. Now, in hindsight, do you think that Michael Foot, Tony Benn, Nye Bevan, Hugh Gaitskell, and Ernest Bevin, they were right after all to warn us against this bureaucracy, against this federal state?
Well, we want to be careful about all this argument about what Churchill meant. I mean, he talked about United Europe. In my view, it was always clear that there were these three concentric circles. There was the United States, there was this continental Europe, and there was the United Kingdom with its Commonwealth. And I don't personally think that he ever envisaged a EU of the sort that developed in British membership. But, you know, these are a long time ago. The speeches were of the need for Europe to come together immediately after the war. There was no doubt about that. It was sensible. Marshall Plan greatly helped it, coming from the United States. And then German rearmament, which was accepted very grudgingly by many people in this country in the early 50s as necessary, facing the USSR. A lot of policies changed because of the expansionist and ideological fervour of Stalin post-war. And I think I would leave aside analogies of what Churchill thought or even what Bevin thought. That was never presented in a really, I mean, the European coal and steel community was the first issue. Bevin was against that, and we didn't get involved in the European coal and steel community. I think Gateskill is a much more significant figure on that. I mean, he opposed a federal union on the basis that he didn't want Britain to be like California or Texas in Europe. And he was one of the first to perceptively warn Britain in 1962, when I had just been adopted as a Labour candidate, actually, in Torrington, North Devon. Gateskill was my hero, and I agreed with him, and I've never shifted my view. I think you can be a very strong European, but not a federalist. And now, thank goodness, after the referendum, we've ended the argument. We are not going to be part of any federal Europe that emerges. We will remain Europeans, and our tasks are going to be different from that of the European Union. And I believe this separation will be difficult, but it can be achieved as long as we make it abundantly clear, which I've never doubted this country is internationalist, and we will have to become again what I've always called blue water diplomatists. Europe is very important. They are our neighbours. You've got to focus on having good relations within those who are closest to you. But we are also historically and still, I think, emotionally readier to see the world as it is, to respond, and we are ready to fight for our views. We are ready to maintain reasonably strong defence forces, although they're perilously cut at the moment, and we're going to have to do something about that. But I don't think there are many analogies from the Churchill period. The war changed everything. The post-war reconstruction was the real driving force. Britain was broke. We had a huge problems of housing, what to do with everybody came back from the troops. The 45-51 Labour governments were a great period of governments in my view, but it was taxing time, and probably inevitable that Labour would come, up against a sort of brick wall of having done so much of its programme by 51. I mean, they nearly won the 51 election. They had the majority vote. But Churchill, of course, by then was far too old. He should never have been Prime Minister in 1951.
After the EU referendum, in which you took an active role in the Leave campaign, and if I may say, surprisingly, you were on the other side of the argument. And then when you wrote that article in The Sun, some people, they were saying, is this really the real Lord Owen who's writing this? This is the man who went on to form the SDP to split up from the Labour Party, because Labour, under Margaret Foot, they wanted to leave the European community.
Look, I don't see any point in fighting the referendum again. We had the referendum, but if you're in any doubt, or your people who watch this blog are in any doubt, my position on the Europe had become pretty obvious from the moment we went into the Eurozone. Europe went into the Eurozone. I never believed that we should do it. I thought it was a flawed concept. I opposed it. I helped create an organisation called New Europe, which was positioned to fight any referendum to take us into the Eurozone that Blair might have wanted to do on the back of the so-called Baghdad bounce, which of course never occurred. And so I then watched as the Eurozone went wrong with the global crisis in 2009, and totally unreformed, still unreformed. I watched what happened to the economy of Greece, where I have a house, but also Portugal, Spain. You can't talk about a social market in Europe with this austerity policy. Unemployment levels of under 25, absolutely shocking. It's a dysfunctional EU now. That's why I came out against it, and no great joy in it. It overreached itself. It should never have gone for a euro, because they want to bet to federal Europe. The people who drive these policies, like the Eurozone, it's designed for. Now they're driving a EU defence policy. Again, a flawed concept designed to damage NATO, an old French Gaullist dream, utterly inappropriate, far too closely supported by America. And that is the challenge now for Europe. We have to rescue NATO. If we don't rescue NATO, you can say goodbye to having any strong influence on Putin's Russia. Putin's Russia is not as it's not a Cold War. It's nowhere near the power and the strength of the Soviet Union. It's just a joke when I hear people talk about it. They never lived through the Cold War. They didn't live through a situation in which all our major cities were targeted by the USSR. No, it's all different. But nevertheless, you're dealing with a Russia which is always will see itself as a powerful country. We've got to look at our relationships with Russia. They need to be both strong and firm on certain areas, but also open and fully ready for dialogue in others. We're getting Russia very badly wrong. We're being outpaced by Putin. Obama and his relationship were very bad, and Putin is not understood enough. You know, I mean, Putin was responding to long-standing Russian policies in Syria, for example. Russia's had a naval base in Syria since 1971. You have people talking about it as if they're an intruder. This is all new. This is all from Putin. I mean, if Putin had been thrown out of a naval base as a result of a successful military action, that would have been a huge humiliation. We would never have put up with it, and he wasn't ready to put up with it. If we'd been more partners in how to handle Syria from earlier on, and let them have a sphere of influence in and around Damascus and the Mediterranean. But those days may be over now. We're facing a very dangerous situation in the next week or two, in which you could see the destruction of Aleppo a la Grozny. The Russians believe that urban warfare is too costly of human life to fight it in a conventional way, and they learnt, as they think, the lessons of the Second World War, and they put it into practice in, I mean, they know how to survive. Stalingrad and this thing, they know what means bombardment, and they are executors of it. They are not going to put troops in to fight house by house in Aleppo, so they will just take it out, I'm afraid, in the next few weeks or months, exactly coinciding where we're fighting in Mosul. Mm-hmm. It's a clever strategy, very, very worrying. No, we need to rethink a lot of our foreign policy now, and with the new American president, that will become even more important. But for Britain, NATO becomes a very, very important element of our foreign policy. We'll be coming out of the EU talking shop, the European External Action Service. The sooner the better, in my view. Having made a terrible mistake in the handling of the Ukraine with the EU-Ukraine agreement, we have to rethink policies towards Ukraine, Georgia, Russia itself, and we have to strengthen NATO, and that will not be easy. Britain will have to spend more than we're spending on defence. Not easy, given all our other difficulties. But we're the only country that can do this and give it a new breath of life and convince the American people that we're no longer going to be what Obama called freeloaders, and we're not, quite rightly I may say, Obama drew attention to the fact that America pays 72% of NATO's costs. That's a totally unrealistic apportionment of financial burden, and Britain will have to fill in. We may even lose this. I mean, we may find that America will walk away from NATO, but not without a fight. And if Americans see a European country fighting for NATO, demonstrating that it matters to them and why American participation and involvement matters to all of us, then we can rescue NATO. But it's going to be difficult.
And two last questions. The first one is about the High Court ruling against the government, which Sajid Javid...
No, let's not go there. Let's not go there. We're still playing itself out. There's nothing. There's nothing sensible to say at the moment. All we know is that there's going to be a repeal, an appeal towards the Supreme Court, and let's hope the Supreme Court.
Do you think that a general election is likely to happen now?
Who knows? I think that let's go through our fence, jump our fences one by one. There has to be an appeal. I mean, I've got no problem whatever in having a resolution of the House of Commons get the members of Parliament to vote for what they effectively...
But there will be a vote in the House of Lords as well, and the peers, they would block it. That's the fear.
Listen carefully to what I said. A single vote, that was just takes one day. Of course, they want legislation in order to take not just one day or not even 1 month, but to block and postpone and everything like that. But I hope the government don't give them that. But so they may even decide. I mean, I would never worry at all about the vote in the House of Commons. It doesn't really matter. I don't believe personally you need it legally. I think it was perfectly reasonable on international matters to use the royal prerogative and to negotiate treaties under the Ponsonby rules, which we have. It's very, very difficult to have parliamentary accountability in negotiating an international treaty where you have to compromise. In this case, very difficult. Under Article 50, we will be 27 countries on one side and ourselves on one. So let's wait and see. I personally think the Supreme Court will, if they've got any sense, find a way of divesting themselves of this judgment, which I think is wrong. Because I believe international affairs has to be dealt with differently, and I think Parliament has devised a system, and a clever system, in which you allow a grouping to, small grouping to negotiate internationally for you, and we use different procedures. And this present argument of the 3 judges didn't, in my view, take enough account of the realities and the way we have changed laws internationally. It's as if they were judging it on a higher plane and ignorant of the actuality of how Parliament over a period of more than a century has developed. But let's see what the Supreme Court do.
And last question. At the beginning of this interview, you said that the House of Lords actually needs to be reformed. And in the new Lord Speaker's manifesto, Lord Fowler's manifesto, he said that the problem is not only to reduce the size of the second chamber, but it's also to reduce the age. Do you agree with him?
Well, of course.
And how do you think that we could reform?
It's ridiculous. Somebody like me.
We've been having this debate for half a century now.
Look, well, yes, of course, it's quite impossible to reform it because the people want an elected. Some people want an elected chamber. The House of Commons is refusing, and there's never a consensus for it. And we've had it all. Paul Clegg was given this role by Cameron and put him through. It failed. So. I only last week made a speech in Cardiff about how to create a federal union and how to deal with the issue of the Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland feeling that they are being marginalised, and particularly post-Brexit, And I think that part of Brexit will actually be to take a step towards a federal UK. And I suggest that we put to one side House of Lords reform, which won't happen, apart from the fact we might get its size reduced because it's so absurd. But nor will they get proportional representation. These are controversial reforms which have been attempted, and go for a proven system of the Bundesrat, which exists in Germany, of a federal council where the federal government is held to account by the 16 landers of very different size. And we in this country now have got 56% of our UK under devolved government, and it's increasing. And I think we should look at a proven system like Germany. I would like a constitutional convention, preferably set up by the Prime Minister, but if it's not done, difficult, but I think very necessary, constitutional convention should be masterminded by the SNP and the Labour Party. And very hard for them to do so, but it's absolutely essential. The whole dynamics of the British Parliament has changed with the SNP. Labour, the chance of Labour coming in without being able to, and having to rely on SNP with a force of MPs of 30 the least, and probably over 40 at the next election. These are the realities that the Labour Party is going to have to start to grapple with. But in the context of a federal UK, I think it would be feasible. So, House of Lords reform, forget it. No, don't have any serious reform. And even getting numbers down will take a long, long time. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. These members of the House of Lords enjoy it. And it's ridiculous. We're not legitimate. A scrutinising chamber can have merits, but the way the House of Lords currently wants to get involved in every possible aspect, well over 800 members now. I mean, it's absurd.
850.
Oh, it's absurd. Absurd.
We shall wait and see, but for now, thank you very much, Lord Owen, for your
Okay,
time.
thank you.
Always. Thank you.
Okay.